I'm going to start with something Nick said while we were hanging out a minute ago, just the three of us with Kay, which is about in your world, sound is data, right? And what does it mean to think about these field recordings as evidentiary proof of behavior of the animals? And just tell us just about your field, right? You know, that bioacoustics of the field. Either of you, both of you, however you want to take it on.
Sure. Well, excuse me. I'll start by saying, so I actually trained in the same lab, the lab of ornithology, many years ago, and that have for the last 15 years worked as a science writer, writing books. And so I don't think of sound as data at all. I think data is something that is stored and is owned and is used to gain knowledge and therefore power over the world. I think of sound until we started recording it in the late 1800s. Sound was only of the moment. It was an ephemeral experience. It was usually communicative. We retained it only through memory and through culture, which is shared storytelling. And more recently, we have added this extra thing, which we are now immersed in, which is recorded sound. So the experience of sound no longer becomes precious and of the moment, because I would argue this is in your house already, because every place on the earth is a unique composition composed of multiple actors, of composers, of birds, of different people, of the trucks driving past, of the insects singing, of the sounds of our own body, that will never, ever again occur in the universe as it is, as we're experiencing in the moment. And we've lost the magic of that because we can call up whatever sound we want on our phone and so on. So I think, yes, sound in a scientific context can be used as data, but I think sound fundamentally and first is an ephemeral transmission of energy that for life at least has been ephemeral and mostly about communication. And lately has gained this new power to be stored and then fed into algorithms and fed into other productions, which I think are wonderful. And I spent a lot of time doing sound recordings myself.
So I dig all that, but yes, yet we use them to learn things, right? So maybe if you guys could tell us what you can learn from listening if we're working with this stuff.
Okay, I can get started, but then you can add on.
Yeah, go for it.
We use sound in overlapping ways. There's been diagrams of the way that we use sound in our work. And maybe I'll touch on a question that was brought up earlier about the recording equipment. So Nick is correct that a lot of the recordings, like ambient recordings of the Bornean rainforest where I work, came from this 8-recorder array. But a lot of those orangutan sounds that were featured there were much more intimately captured with me carrying a shotgun microphone and observing these animals and making those recordings from a few meters away, which is why I know who made those calls and I know a little bit about the context and I can start to like connect.
Right, you're like the boom operator on a film shoot.
Something like I've never done, but I can imagine got a similar. And so a lot of the like using those particular types of recordings, so we call them focal recordings because here the other kind is this passive for autonomous recordings. Like I said, because I'm there on the ground with the animals and making observations and tying these things, like I could use sound as a way to understand perhaps meaning or at least like contextual understanding of function for those sounds. Or as the case that we explored in the piece together is how the sounds change for the animals as they're inhaling this really terrible air pollution for months at a time from these wildfire peatlands or peatland wildfires, right? So I can look at those super intimately on a spectrogram, which I think you're going to show us together what a spectrogram is for those of you who haven't seen it. And I can measure very intricate details about the changes in those sounds. So that's one example of a way that we can use sound. And I think you use sound rather differently in your work.
Yeah, I was going to add that
For me as a scientist, sound is one approach that we use to study biodiversity, amongst other ways. But it can't completely replace the rigorous, behavioral and sort of like observations that we make in nature. Uh, yeah, I think we can talk more about the recordings. But
And you said we have a slide of a sonogram.
yeah, I can a little bit that. I just put together some of our work from the Western Ghats just to give some more context to where our work is situated and how we use sounds. Uh, so that's the Western Ghats. That's a mountain chain that runs along the southwestern coast of India. It's a biodiversity hotspot, home to some of the most endangered and endemic wildlife in the Indian subcontinent. And uh, in the piece that you heard before, one of the things that kept coming up is the presence of people. And the India and other tropical landscapes are really unique in that they're shared landscapes. So people are literally sharing their backyards of wildlife with, charismatic megafauna like elephants and leopards to some of the taxa that I study, which is birds. And when I first came to this landscape in 2020, I encountered this long-term ecological restoration program that a non-profit called the Nature Conservation Foundation had been doing. And when I first arrived there, one of the questions was that the restoration work has really helped in bringing back many of these degraded forest patches uh, to bring back many of these rainforest trees in these once degraded patches. But we want to understand our birds coming back to these forests. So we placed recorders across all of these forest patches. And to give you some context to how these recorders are usually placed in these forests, here's an image of a recorder tied to a tree in the middle of these rainforests. And this is a soundscape from one of our recordings. And as a scientist, one of the things that we do is we convert these sounds into images to study them. And here you see what Wendy was talking about is spectrogram. And spectrograms are acoustic signatures of these wildlife or animals vocalizing there. And on the y-axis, you see frequency. And one of the cool things about this image is I can pinpoint where different birds are. So I can pinpoint where the brown-cheeked fulmeta is. Or for example, the bell-like sound that you hear is the racketeering bronco. Or the, where is it? The Canada Placatcha and the crimson back sunbird, which you also hear. And we retrieve a lot of these data from different sites, from degraded forests, restored forests, and forests that have never been logged before. And I just wanted to briefly show you what these soundscapes are like. Here's a recording from one of our degraded forests. You're probably not hearing much because these forests are fairly quiet and they're largely devoid of quite a bit of diversity. And you often see a number of birds that don't really care much about really good quality habitat, like bee eaters or rufous babblers, for example. And when the nonprofit that I worked with started doing restoration, we started noticing that when we analyzed this audio data, many of these birds started returning to these restored forests. And we started hearing a lot more rainforest birds. And this was a really positive and encouraging result for the 3 decades of restoration work that's being carried out. So you hear the racketeering bronco again, the hill miner, but these soundscapes are still unmatched by what you hear in protected areas near Parit. These are forests that have really mature trees that are over 200 to 300 years old, and the hope is one day restoration might recover some of these soundscapes that are present in these forests. But when someone asks me, what do we do, how long does it take? Often I say that, the first that we have, I think our first priority should be preserve what we have and then continue to, restore some of these degraded forest patches. I'll stop there just to give you a glimpse of some of our work.
Yeah, but that's amazing. The full circle, right? Just to full circle it to what Wendy was talking about. The acoustic signatures of that area gives you some evidentiary proof or indication that the ecological restoration is successful. Like it's easier to listen than to try to put cameras everywhere and figure it out that way, right? So there is some of that.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Wendy can add to this. When you are in a tropical forest, 80% of the birds that you're documenting is often by ear, more than so you're often hearing them before you're even seeing them.
For sure.
And audio recorders are a unique and a good way to capture the biodiversity. All right. And the other thing I'll add is that when we carry out manual surveys, we're often standing in one location for about 20 minutes. But sometimes the diversity that you hear is so overwhelming that it's so hard to note all of that down. When we have these audio recorders, you can go back to these recordings and figure out, oh, I missed that hill by another. And, figure out what actually is present there. And all of that missing data can be captured.
Right. That's awesome.
One other thing that I think is really impressive about these recorders is that they record often for 24/7. You can feed them into statistical analysis programs that then reveal things, subtle differences about the patterns at dawn or dusk in the middle of the day that no human has enough time to listen to all those recordings, one, and then second, to discern those subtleties. So I think that's one way, and particularly with sophisticated statistical approaches now, which can process a lot of data, we can start to hear beyond what any human could hear, not just in the pitch, the frequency, but in the patterns among days between forests that have been logged in different ways or protected using different policies. So it's really giving us a kind of power that can be used for good to manage forests in more sustainable ways.
Right. So in the call we did, disclosure, we all met each other for like 30 minutes on the Zoom call last week. One of the things we talked about was and Kay brought it up is the anthropogenic pollution and its impact on these creatures and these biomes and all that stuff. And you mentioned like your orangutans basically have a smoker's cough, right, from all the air pollution, but there's also noise pollution in these spaces, and maybe talk about that a little bit, because that's something we riffed on.
Yeah, I can get us started, Evan, please. Anybody join in? Certainly, I think in the Misha's part of the piece, we got to hear those were shocking sounds, like being in this immersive experience and listening to those. Like, you could very much sympathize with what these animals are experiencing, listening to these cruise ships and air guns, and the wealth of information that we already have about how these kinds of sounds, whether it's construction sounds or aircraft sounds or cruise ships or traffic sounds, the cascading effects that they have on these animals, from like stress levels to sleep quality to heart damage to cognitive dysfunction.
Right.
It's like from fish to frogs to mammals and birds to ourselves. It's incredible that this is such a huge problem for our own species and for so many species around the world. And it feels like something that just we don't talk or think about. I don't know, especially living in a place like New York City. I mean, we live in Ithaca now, but we both lived in New York for many years. And I don't know, for me, every time I come, it's like this, it's acoustically shocking to come back to New York City.
It's kind of loud. But
It's also, I mean, it's not just about climate change.
right.
It's about industrialization and urbanization and mining and all of the noise pollutants, which have secondary effects and they are evidence of climate change, but also evidence of just the Anthropocene, basically.
Right. And the sound first approach, I want to hear what you have to say, David. Like the sound first approach to this artwork is just like a really great way of centering that fact, right? Like making you listen to it before you see it. And it's not just this like ancillary effect of watching a film, right? It's like really the center of the story is the sound.
I also think there's, there are many unique, affordances of listening in sound, as sensory stimuli. But one of the things is that you cannot gaze that sound, which you can in an image. So you can take a whole image. If you looked at a painting of a beach scene, you would see the sun, the sea, the sand, all in one go. But you can't read sound that way. But you have to read it episodically. So you, by forcing people, hopefully voluntarily, to listen to a piece, there's something about that experience of the requirement to slow down and to take sound in episodically that allows you to think about stuff in a really different way to looking at official information.
One sort of optimistic thing about sound pollution is the minute you stop making the sound is gone. Unlike mercury pollution, carbon pollution, other things that would be with us for generations.
There's a minor silver lining.
Well, actually, it's a major silver lining because 40% of the shipping traffic in the world is transporting fossil fuels from one continent to another. And shipping is one of the major sources of sound pollution in the ocean. So if we decarbonize our economy, which the US is choosing not to this year, but hopefully in future years we might. But other countries, I mean, China is putting out 3 coal-fired power stations worth of solar panels capacity per day this year. So it's extraordinary acceleration of decarbonization, which of course has benefits for the atmosphere, but also directly quiets the ocean down. And if we clean propellers on the back of the big ships and reshape the design of the propellers a little bit, extraordinary reduction in sound. Intelligent city planning, which cities are across the US now are more aware of air pollution and noise pollution. So I think, yes, there are dire problems. And in my book, I talk about the oceans being an acoustic hell in many places and the worst form of sound pollution.
I directed a film once for the architect Maya Lin, where I got to create the human equivalent of naval sonar on whales by dropping a 727 jet engine into the middle of an intimate date in a French restaurant.
That's about the right level.
Yeah, so that was, you go infinite, you go instantly deaf, it destroys your vestibular system so you can no longer have balance. And
And the good thing is that the U.S. Navy is now required to account for and plan for and gradually ramp up the sound when they're doing Navy exercises. And the Western states in the United States, actually, the governors wrote to the military to implore them to change their strategy. So there is actually there's a lot of data that came from scientists that then translates into policy that is making the world better, which one of the wonderful things about this project is it's part of that effort to get knowledge about sound pollution and the lives of other creatures out beyond just policymakers and scientists. So that's what's beautiful to me is that we've already done some great work, and this can be one body.
And I think that rounds it back actually to this really core thing before I turn it over to the audience about what's great about this piece is the power of art for rhetoric around science communication, right? So like if the goal of all of your work to not be for naught is to get across to everyone that these are really important themes that we need to think about the soundscape, to use the Armour Schaefer term that's problematic in its own way, but like whatever of how we listen and how it impacts these animals, right? Like working with a board certified composer and a brilliant, like a dramatic producer and all these amazing artists is a way to do this, right? Like, and I think, I don't know, thinking about that side of it, where do you guys want to see this taken next? Or where do you think how should this be broadened out?
I think briefly, just before this event, Nick and I were talking a bit more about spatial audio, and I think one of the cool things in our field that's moving towards is trying to localize where exactly the sounds are coming from. So if you were to place a tetrahedral microphone, can I figure out if there's a wobbler there, or there's a wobbler there, or there are three wobblers that are calling from all three directions? I think that's truly changing the way we're able to study populations of different species and understand what's happening across different ecosystems. I think that is truly fascinating to me, and including that sort of audio within some of these, in such an exhibit would be amazing.
Right. To being able to walk around and see how they're moving and everything. Yeah. What are you using?
I mean, I'm excited about the ideas that are already percolating and certainly having something immersive and interactive. I hadn't given this question too much thought, but now that you've asked me and put me on the spot, I'm also like certainly thinking about the people in the amazing places where I have the luxury to do this work and make these recordings. And how delightful it would be to be able to share those with the communities that live and work in these forests with me.
And include that as well in the piece. I think that would be really, really interesting. It's one of the things we talked about really early on is kind of including Indigenous storytelling and and voices in the piece as well. One thing I wanted to ask you was about the difference between communicating as a scientist and as an artist. And I touched on this in the last session, the kind of the importance of rigor in not changing scientific endeavor, but communicating it in a different way. And I wondered what you sort of thought the value of art is in communicating the science.
It's really actually hard to articulate what the elevation factor is for it because it's I don't know, there's just like this thing that is still stuck in my head that David said in the piece that was listening is generative. And I can't get it out of my head. And it's like we can communicate and share this information about what we're learning and what species are here and what species are there and what species are lost and which ones come back. We can describe it all. And I think that it's still like not enough to know. It's something different to experience and to connect and to listen, actually. Um, so I do see like this incredible um, explosion of potential to really like bring people in. And it's more of an awareness. It's more than awareness. It's like it's a connectedness and it's feeling empowered to be part of it.
How do you think about the ultimate goals of whatever you think of society? How integration versus apartedness, all this stuff. The person asking the question is from the place where you are recording. So that's so cool.
Thank you for that question. As a scientist, I think one of the things that I keep thinking about is how do I translate some of the work that I'm doing into conservation action? How can it lead to conservation impact on the ground? Uh, my skill set is in trying to use all of these different ways of observing nature, different sorts of data sets, and how do we quantify that? And how do we communicate with policymakers to provide them with recommendations about what needs to be done, whether uh, we need to restore this particular degraded forest a certain way because insects are not coming back. So what do we need to do? Do we need to monitor the microclimate in this particular area? That's how I approach it as a scientist. And the other thing I would say is that it is hard, especially given all that we see about uh, uh, climatic changes and habitat loss, and at a much broader global level, there isn't that much impetus to work on it. But on the ground, I'm seeing quite a bit of action, and so it's working with local communities working with conservation practitioners on the ground to effectively lead to, create this particular conservation action. That's how I approach my work.
Sir.
Yeah. My question is, so which particular areas in the U.S. do you think require the most attention in terms of conservation bioacoustics, and what are steps that everyday people like us can do to support said conservation?
I would say so. In terms of what can we do, working locally and figuring out what's going on in a local context. So here in New York, for example, there is a strong correlation between air pollution and noise pollution because of traffic. And so groups like We Act for Environmental Justice, which is still mostly based in West Harlem, but they work all over the city, and their vision is actually has gone sort of nationwide. Very influential group of working on these issues around environmental justice. Which communities have to listen to the bus depots stocking up every morning and the air pollution that comes from that, and have made some amazing strides in terms of fighting those environmental injustices that affect both human beings and non-human life. So figuring out sort of local uh, uh, where to sort of find points of leverage locally. Without a doubt, in terms of noise pollution, that the worst situations are in the oceans, and there are generally public feedback mechanisms for offshore drilling and so forth, but it's all fairly, perhaps by design, hidden from public view. And there's a lot of misinformation. For example, the current leader of the regime in DC right now talks a lot about the noise impact of offshore windmills being built, which is minuscule. It is a legit, there's noise associated with that. But compared to the sound of seismic oil exploration, to find oil drilling is a absolutely tiny little problem. So they're taking a grain of truth and magnifying it into a big lie. So seeing through some of those stories is problematic. But I do think in the U.S., the situation with noise in cities, it comes from 20th century policies that were deliberately classist and racist, that put busy highways through Black and brown neighborhoods, through low-income neighborhoods, as a matter of design policy in New York with Robert Moses and others, but is a prime example of that. But where I live in Atlanta, same thing happened, not just one, but two interstates put through the most well-to-do, affluent, functional Black community in the entire United States, arguably. They hit it with two different interstates. So now those communities are coming together to mitigate that sound of that pollution, but also to make sure that doesn't happen again. So I think the action really is it's in the oceans and in the cities. And there's a strain of American environmentalism that regards cities as the bad places and urbanization as bad. But in fact, your average city dweller uses far less carbon, far less environmental footprint than people living out in the countryside. When you need to go to CVS, you got to drive 15 miles, right? Whereas in the city, you walk down the block. So I think this narrative of pitting the rural areas against urban areas and looking down on urban areas environmentally, I think is problematic. And including noise, quote unquote, pollution. What one person's pollution is another person's sound of home, right? So if you're used to noise on the street, people playing dominoes on the street, and then other folks move into the neighborhood and start making noise complaints, noise pollution, quote unquote, becomes an agent of gentrification. So a little bit of cultural nuance about what is noise, and being aware that, yes, noise pollution, if you're on the flight path into LaGuardia, there's an issue there. And even if you're used to it, it's affecting your bodily health. But there's also a way in which noise is in the eye of the beholder. And I grew up in cities in Europe, and sort of the sound of the garbage trucks and people on the street, to me, that's soothing, and it's the sound of home because I grew up in that. So, and I love the question about how to live with, because I think that the big ethical question for our time is how to belong on this planet as humans, not to imagine ourselves as separate from quote unquote nature. We're as natural and as wild as an old redwood tree, right? We're primates here. We're clever, we make tools, we make auditoriums, but we belong on this planet. How can we be good kin and neighbors? And I think listening, deep listening in our neighborhoods and also beyond our neighborhoods through marvelous work like this is part of that work of discerning who am I and how can I belong here.
Maybe I might be there, but maybe one more question and we'll break. Anybody?
I'm curious, you were talking about past species in the ocean, but clearly everywhere are stressed by sap and other plagues. And I'm wondering, are there current studies being done, say, once during the pandemic when there was not this, the food was quiet versus pre or after?
Yeah, so we're doing studies on sound in the ocean. Yeah,
Hungry.
yeah.
I can't talk about ocean work, but what that you had mentioned about like post-pandemic, pre-pandemic, there was a really cool study coming out of San Francisco where they were recording sparrows, and they noticed that sparrows started singing at slightly different frequencies due to absence of certain noises during the lockdown. And that was really unique because within a short span of time, these species are changing the way they are singing or changing the frequencies at which they're singing. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, Misha's study comes to mind, of course. I remember just as Cornell started shutting down, sitting in our center with Michelle and be Michelle as she is, like she just instantly was like, I have this idea. We need to study what the whales are going to do with everything shutting down. And I actually don't know if she's published that work yet because the academic publishing process gets drawn out sometimes for years. But I know that she's been working on that particularly for the places in Alaska where she's been doing recordings. I know there's been like camera trapping studies and other work showing the animals are certainly responding to the fact that they're relieved of not this noise pollution, but also other kinds of human activities in our presence.
I remember her telling me that one of the predominant sounds that she could hear was ice tinkling during the pandemic, which was not audible before, but probably was 400 years ago. So I love her idea of the idea of hearing the ocean as it was 400-500 years ago, and for the I don't know, but 6 million years before that, and then suddenly we've got this chance to capture what it might have been like, and probably won't be like that again. So.
I think it will be like that again. I mean, so the oil's going to run out. I mean, the current noise situation in the ocean will absolutely not be here in this.
2 years later, we will all kill one another.
Well, no, we will thrive. We will learn how to belong on this planet. And so after 9/11, actually, the first shutdown, not just airplanes but shipping stopped for a few days, and there were people studying stress hormones in whales, and the stress hormones dropped way off for those few days when everything went silent after 9/11. And so those studies will be coming out and the sparrow, Elizabeth Derrida's work from San Francisco is amazing. These sparrows went back to singing how they were singing back in the 1950s because all the traffic went away within a few days, which shows how adaptable the sparrows are, which makes sense because they live on the edge of the ocean. And so over millions of years, they've gotten used to some of them living in quiet places, but some living next to the crashing ocean waves, which is kind of like traffic noise, right? And so they've got it within them to sing louder and higher frequency, higher pitch when they're in a noisy place. And we just happen to build the ocean kind of inland and call it San Francisco. So they adapt a bit. And we do the same. When we're in a loud place, we talk louder and a higher pitch, which we're in New York, so let's celebrate that.
Cool. Well, Thanks all of you. Really good. You got-
The hell with that. We're just gonna
Well, I just want to invite you all to join us in the back of the museum in the Fox Auditorium and outside in our beautiful courtyard for a reception. And I think Kay had the words before we do that. I just mostly want to thank the Museum of the Moving Image. It's a real privilege and pleasure to be in this space and to have worked with them. They were really great partners, and to my staff and everybody involved. And I do want you to come to reception and talk to us about your experience and the visuals, because we're really in the midst of making this. It'll be kind of like a hydra. It'll be several kinds of things, and I really love your feedback. So come and talk. And thank you for coming.